Good afternoon and good evening to everyone in Europe. I am Daniel Fried. I'm speaking on behalf of the Atlantic Council's Central European Week, which is a week-long series of events devoted to promoting the US and Central European Common Agenda. And the occasion for today's particular event is to launch a paper that my colleagues from the Atlantic Council and GlobeSec and I have written, which outlines a prospective US Central European agenda for a post-COVID world, and in particular, the post-COVID democratic world or the free world, as we try to get ourselves on our feet and dealing with the challenges and opportunities in the eventual post-COVID environment. My colleagues are going to speak about the paper and its contents, but the paper represents two assumptions. One is that there is going to be a democratic world or a free world, unified or at least coordinated strategy for post-COVID challenges. Now that seems sometimes like a leap, given the sour state of much of the transatlantic relationship, but we're looking on the bright side, and we are also looking at history. The United States and Europe didn't have ever a golden age of 100% harmony. Didn't exist. We always squabbled, and there were a lot of low points. We're in one now. But we're not going to get out of it by wringing our hands and talking about the good old days. We will get out of it by putting ourselves to work to forge the future. We were particularly interested in the US Central European aspect of this because the United States and Central Europe drove much of the common transatlantic agenda over the past generation. And I have in mind specifically the US response to the challenges and opportunities of 1989 and in the 90s, when we helped build a Europe whole, free, and at peace together, the US and Central Europe. One of the things that bound us were common values. And this came first, not from the Americans, but from the Central Europeans, who, starting in the 1970s, insisted that the Americans apply values to their relations with then communist Central and Eastern Europe. They were more consistent, not the governments, but the democratic dissidents were more consistent than we Americans were at the time. Before the Carter administration, the Nixon administration wasn't that much interested in democracy in Central Europe. But later, starting with Carter and Brzezinski, and a lot more with Reagan, we found that it was central. And our support for common values and the Central Europeans pushing us to regard that as central to our relations had profound and good impact. So that was some of the spirit in which I and my colleagues from the Atlantic Council, Denise Forsthuber, plus Elena Kuzko, and Jakub Wiśniewski of GlobeSec wrote this paper. We try to make our recommendations practical, but also informed by higher values and higher issues. So that's quite enough for me. I hope that you follow the events of Central Europe Week. That's hashtag Central Europe Week if you want to follow along. We're doing a lot these days. Anyway, I turn it now over to Elena Kuzko, my co-author, my colleague from now in Bratislava, but originally from Belarus, where the people are giving us a daily lesson in democratic commitment. It is inspiring. So over to you, Elena.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for reiterating the spirit in which the United States and Central Europe have worked together and towards which we're going to work. Good morning, Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. And thank you so much to our friends from the Atlantic Council for organizing the wonderful Central European Week, including, of course, these events. And congratulations on the great launch of the week yesterday with the ministerial panel that I highly recommend to everybody to watch in case you missed it. I couldn't wish for a better lineup of speakers to discuss the resilience and recovery post COVID-19 and what kind of a common agenda the United States and Central Europe can embark upon to get out of this crisis together. So here today with me, I have Julia Friedlander, who is Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director at Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council. I have Radovan Geist, who is the publisher at the Euroactiv SK, joining us from Slovakia. I have Konrad Poplawski, who is head of Central European Department at the Center for European Studies, joining us from Poland. I have also Tomasz Proza, who is president at the Confederation of Trade and Tourism, joining us from the Czech Republic. And we also have Martin Ugrajdi, who is director at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade, joining us from Hungary. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for joining. As Ambassador Fried has just mentioned, the Atlantic Council and GlobSec just released a report where we outlined the potential and possible, and from our perspective, desirable agenda, how the United States and Central Europe can work together. At that time, when we were writing it, we did not quite know yet how strong the second wave would be. And we did not know that now we should be talking not just about the post-COVID-19 recovery, but also about how we can overcome this second wave. So I will first go to Konrad. Konrad, given where we are now, in terms of what we've been through in the first wave, but in terms of also the second wave, what do you believe is the most important agenda that we should be focusing on right now to navigate out of this destructive pandemic?
Thank you for the organizer for organizing this panel, and thank you for this paper, which I read with great pleasure. I would say that COVID, we don't know how long COVID will last. We don't know how the pandemic will occur, what will be the consequence, but we know already two things. First thing, that it will affect the economy, and second thing, that it will accelerate digitalization. And I think both of these areas are perfect, are areas where US and Central Europe are perfect match. Why? I would say that in the last years, the US and Central Europe turned out to be long-standing and reliable security and political partners and allies. But I would say that economic area was a little neglected. It didn't follow so fast the pace of development of relations, security, and political sphere. And I would say that I see here a great potential. First of all, we need more engagement of US companies in Central Europe. I would say that we are getting more and more promoted in American business. Even the events from this year could be an example of it. We had just and it was just announced the investment of Microsoft of $1 billion in Poland in some service center, and of Google of $2 billion US dollars also in Poland. So two largest investments in Polish history, showing that actually the American digital companies see that actually Central Europe dispose about great skills for development of business in Europe. But it could also strengthen the transatlantic agenda, because actually the EU is in the process of transforming itself. We are actually in the process of Brexit. Great Britain will leave is leaving the community, and we will have to learn how to live without it. And actually, there are different concepts how the future EU should look like. Should it be more protectionist? Should we be more open free markets? Or should it be more transatlantic, or maybe less transatlantic? And I would say that strengthening economic pillar of relations between Central Europe and so the second lung of the EU and the US would strengthen very transatlantic and pro-Atlantic countries with rather similar view of economy as in the US. So very free markets. So in that case, it could be a pillar that will somehow substitute the Great Britain, the lack of Great Britain in the EU. So thank you for this introductory remark.
Thank you so much, Konrad, for outlining the agenda and highlighting the importance of economic cooperation, which is because of the way how we underperformed in it in the past has a huge potential now. And I will go with that to Tomasz. Tomasz, you've been working on the transatlantic issues for a very long time. And Konrad also mentioned that security definitely was one of the main pillars throughout the history of cooperation between the United States and Central Europe and the European Union in general. How do you see the intersection of security and economic agenda, and how would you want to see the future of relations between the US and Central Europe?
Once again, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and thank you for having me. It's a nice throwback to many of these discussions while I had more time to work on the political and diplomatic issues. Well, let me go back a little bit, even though Ambassador Free didn't want to dwell on the past, but there's one thing we should keep in mind in the discussions we're having, that and the situation and relationships have significantly changed. Early 1990s, the U.S. Central European relationship was probably a very good textbook example of capturing hearts and minds. I think for most of us, the U.S. Was what we always looked up to. We always wanted to have as close a relationship as possible with the United States. I remember I was 18 when George Bush Sr. came to Prague in November 1990 and rang a copy of the Liberty Bell on the Wenceslav Square, where the revolution just happened a year ago. I worked at the Czech embassy as an intern in 1995, where the US State Department financed a significant outreach program for young diplomats from Central Europe. But that was also probably the last time, maybe ending around year 2000, when there was a significant American investment into building personal relationship between the young people of Central Europe and the US. Later on, with our accession to the EU, it all got replaced with the Erasmus program. A lot of university students are simply traveling and studying only in Europe, and building these personal relationships almost ceased with the US. And the investment probably went elsewhere. But I see that as a significant weakness because I think my generation, my colleagues from that time who joined the diplomatic service in mid-1990s were the last ones who actually had a lot of physical experience working, living in the US, and had also a lot of personal connections. And that is important, and that is missing now. So I think that is one important thing, because we learned, I think, very well to deal with the transactional agenda. It was, I think, brought in by Barack Obama with all his pivots to Asia, pivots to Latin America. So we learned to focus on pragmatic issues. Conrad mentioned economic cooperation. We all always did as much as we could to help the US investors come into Central Europe. Always, I think the Americans were welcomed very effectively. And we always worked very well on these security issues. I think our cooperation of our security services with the CIA, with the other security institutions of the US, I think has been exemplary. We're always very effective in sharing information. Czech Republic specifically in the last 7-8 years, even work as the protective power for the US in Syria. We're the last ones to still keep an embassy and the connections we had there. So I think that is life and well, and this will keep going. But what we miss really in all these discussions is the values agenda. I know it's very hard to bring it back. It's much harder to push for values in the current environment. But I think unless we bring that back, we'll only keep focusing on the transactional issues. And that also, I think, for many politicians, even in the Czech Republic, when you don't have the values, they don't care whether they make the transaction with the US or China or Russia. And that I see as a strategic threat to the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you so much, Tomasz. You mentioned several very important issues that I'm sure we'll elaborate more, but including also the importance of the people-to-people cooperation, but how we can bring in younger people into the believers of the transatlantic agenda, especially also on the economic issues, because after all, we're talking about their future as well. And that seems to me like a very good connection to Radovan. Radovan, I know you worked a lot about on the issues of the European Union and how the European Union is planning to deal, especially with the economic slump that we're currently observing in Europe. Could you explain to us a little bit more what is the EU strategy to cope with the COVID-19 crisis and its aftermath?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the opportunity to talk in this wonderful panel. Let me start with a little bit broader perspective. So, if you look back, let's say 15 years, you can say that the EU has been constantly going through a succession of crises. If you remember the constitutional treaty in 2004, 5, and 6, it was a huge crisis in the EU, crisis of mutual trust, a big of new treaty infrastructure in Europe hasn't succeeded, and we have to settle for some kind of a compromise with the Lisbon Treaty. Then came the financial crisis, economic crisis, Eurozone, migration, and so on and so forth. So if you look back at those 15 years, a succession of crises, some of them solved, some of them just, solved partially. And now we are in a situation of a multiple crisis that the EU is facing, with it as an extra added this year. This leads me to 2 points. First of all, on one hand, EU wasn't very well equipped to weather the rainy days, you can say. I mean, in many areas, the cooperation was not, or the institutions were not prepared to deal with the major crisis. Yet, on the other hand, by overcoming these crises, even though it was through muddling through or some kind of improvisation, the EU has been building up institutional resilience. It doesn't mean EU will necessarily overcome each crisis, but it only means that it kind of builds up the history of cooperation on overcoming the crisis in Europe. Now, I think there is a certain element which is kind of common for all the responses to these multiple crises in the EU that we can call successful. And for me, the element is that the response should be built on the shared interests, not on some kind of balance of individual interests. So, of course, individual interests have to be interests of member states have to be reflected in this shared interest. But I believe that the priority is on finding the shared interest, not just the lowest mutual denominator. Now, this leads us to the COVID crisis. Unlike many other issues that EU had to solve in the last few years, COVID was, we can say, really unexpected. Okay, it could have been expected. Things like this might happen, but the scale and the impact on the economy, I don't think anybody's expecting that at the beginning of this year. Overall, I think if you look at the response of the EU after first few weeks and months when we are trying to find kind of a balance and compromise, I think overall the response, especially when we talk about economy, was quite successful, and for me it was surprisingly successful. Of course, the recovery package, which was agreed, I mean, it's not fully unprecedented because EU has been agreeing on things like this to some extent in the past. But I think its size, which might be modest when we compare it to to budgets of federal states, but I think it's quite big when we compare it to the amounts we had at the beginning of this year. The way it will be financed, so it's financed through jointly guaranteed loans, which is again something nobody could have expected at the beginning of this year, but also the planned use of the funds. I think this is something which we can say, of course, we had to make many compromises. The size is much lower than, for example, the European Commission or Germany and France were proposing at the very beginning. The balance between grants and loans is not ideal for some countries, but at the end, I think it reflects more the mutual interest than just kind of a common denominator of the individual interests of member states. And when we talk about the planned use of funds, I think I would like to stress three elements, and then I will get to the connection to transatlantic cooperation. And I think it's very important that this money will not be used only to start some kind of economic recovery, but they are all going to be used for longer term ends. First of all, I think it's important that part of the money will go to finance the green transition. Second, I think it's important that the investment made through the recovery fund will strengthen the let's call it strategic sovereignty of Europe in many areas, for example, in digital area. And last but not least, I think it's important that we use this opportunity to strengthen the institutional infrastructure for sustaining and guaranteeing the rule of law in the member states of the EU. Now, if we manage to do these three things, which are somehow included in the general agreement of the EU leaders from the summit in June, I think the result will be that the EU will be not only, that we will not only restart the economic recovery, but also that EU will be more sustainable and resilient. Now, getting to connection to transatlantic relations, think that strong EU, strong Europe with strategic sovereignty in important areas is not a contradiction to transatlantic partnership. I think it's for me, it's one of the preconditions. Because I think if the partnership is supposed to be kind of sustainable and supported by both sides, it has to be built on kind of a balance of capacities. And only when this partnership is balanced, it would also be built on the shared interests. So, of course, I do agree that the, let's say, interests or pragmatic calculations do play a role in forging partnerships. And I think there are many pragmatic reasons why we should keep the transatlantic partnership growing. But at the same time, I think this pragmatism should not be like the main issue. It should be the partnership should be based on the shared interests. And this is true also for the Visegrad countries and the transatlantic partnership. Of course, there are many areas where we could develop the partnership with individually or as a group of countries. But I think, and this is the last point I want to make in this introduction, I think the overall framework for developing this partnership is the European integration and our membership in the EU, or in case of Slovakia, the monetary union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radovan, for bringing in the EU perspective as well into the dimension. Ambassador Fried, but also you and Tomasz were talking a lot about the importance of framing the discussion about transatlantic relations into the issues of values. It was very valuable historically, but now the issue is again on the agenda. And I want to go to Martin for his take on how our perception of the common values also converts into a more coherent joint policy between the United States and Europe in relations to other countries in the world. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about how we should be treating China. And there has been some discrepancy on both sides of the Atlantic how we can approach this issue. Martin, how would you explain to us where the interests between Central Europe and the United States align with regards to China, and how the values are here intersecting with the issues of economy and security?
Well, thank you, Elena. It's great to be part of this conversation. Many of my colleagues earlier alluded to the transatlantic link, and Bush 41 was also mentioned, and I think it's kind of a signal that his statue was unveiled today at Liberty Square, just across the US Embassy here in Budapest. So we do have fond memories of those times, and Ambassador Fried also talked about this, that how the US started to engage democratic opposition during the communist times. And I would also like to refer to the report that was published by the Atlantic Council and GLOBSEC together. And there's a poll of the Central European countries asking people that which forms of government are better for their country. And it was asked, like having a liberal democracy with regular elections and multi-party systems still has very much support in the region. And what is really significant in this regard, I think, is that Hungary scores over 80% when it comes to the support for regular elections and multi-party system. And Poland comes third after Austria and Hungary with also around 65%. So people do value the liberty to choose their political leaders. And I think if we look at the recent developments of the parties in the region staying on power, winning successive elections, I think it is against this backdrop that that signifies that which parties have the popular support of the people, and why they are so successful in staying on power for a long time. But coming back to the China question, I think it's really hard to avoid nowadays when it comes to the US and Central Europe. And I think one of the experiences that the region had over time, that it's not that good to be caught in great power competition when it comes to either European or non-European great powers. And I think we're facing one of these times when questions about our relationships to third players, and I'm quite sure that we can name China and Russia as number ones of concern in this regard, is that it is really hard to avoid geography. First of all, when it comes to Russia, we're still struggling with our Soviet heritage when it comes to reliance on energy sources. And there have been some progress made recently, also within the framework of the 3Cs initiative when it comes to liquefied natural gas coming to the region, and also finding alternative sources of energy, also increased cooperation in the energy field. And that also connects us to how we can manage the economic crisis after COVID-19. But also, I think it's really interesting to see that finally the US and Europe started to take the processes in the region more seriously. And now we're seeing alternative approaches to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think the 3Cs is very important in this regard. We just had the summit last week, and the digital component was mentioned by Konrad in the first intervention. So there is something brewing in there. And I think that is very beneficial for the region. So the good part of the great power competition when it comes to what we can do with these outside players is really interesting nowadays. But also, if we look at digitalization and if we look at how we can manage the post-COVID economic crisis, technological development will be in front and center. And I think tomorrow there will be the launching event of the digital recommendations by the Atlantic Council for the 3Cs countries. And I think what ideas are presented there are really important when it comes to how digitalization, which was partly forced by the lockdowns in the spring, can be utilized in the long run. And here we really have to look at the different forms of technology. And we have to admit that China has made some significant developments in that regard recently. And it's really hard to disregard them when it comes to 5G networks, when it comes to different digital tools, and so on and so forth. But I think the business case is very important. So if it is possible to present credible alternatives, which also have the business case when it comes to building 5G networks using different devices and keep the system running, I think we can have a meaningful debate, which is not over politicized when it comes to how to build the future mobile networks. And last point in my first intervention is that it's a big question that what's going to happen to reshoring and nearshoring efforts when we look at global supply chains. So when we talk about the economic recovery, and I think if you've been following what the Hungarian foreign minister has been doing recently by attracting and announcing significant amounts of foreign direct investment coming to the country, I think it's really important for the Central and Eastern European countries to use this as an opportunity to bring in new businesses, especially in the high value added sector, in the high-tech sector. And curiously enough, if you think these investments might come back to Europe in some cases from China, because the supply chains are just too long. And we've seen it in the spring that physical disruptions of these global value chains can make the situation very complicated for global transnational companies. And I think I'll stop here, and I guess there will be quite a few questions on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for a bouquet of issues that's now added to our agenda. And I'll move to Julia now for perspective from the United States. We've heard the ideas from the four speakers who represent four Visegrad countries. Julia, is that something that resonates well in the United States? How do you think the United States sees Central Europe in terms of what areas of cooperation are the most promising and where we can work closely together? Also, I would be very curious for your thoughts on this matter of strategic competition. Martin was talking a lot about strategic competition with China and how we can jointly with the EU, US, and of course Central Europe as part of the EU approach the issue of China. But also it cannot be missed that there are certain friction between the US and Europe who sometimes also see each other as strategic competitors. How would you square these positions?
Sure. Thanks, Elena, and thanks so much for including me in this wonderful panel. I would start by saying that the global crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic has almost by necessity caused us to turn inwards a little bit. So, and you'll see in the assistance packages that were passed in previous months, what's earmarked for potential assistance that may or may not come in the coming months. And really, the campaign promises of both Trump and Biden reflect a need to turn back inward a little bit and see to the needs of the American people and their economic misfortunes in a lot of ways. And we see sort of a brand of mistrust in institutions and in the economy itself to serve the needs of the people. And I think that's going to be a big point of reckoning, regardless of the outcome of the election. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind. But also global growth and global response, we're all interconnected, right? And I think it's important for the United States also to recognize, and for the European Union to see that recovery in America and recovery in Europe are sort of reflections of each other. And so I think what we would say from the Treasury Department point of view, where we've always been supportive of European integration, right? Back in the European Eurozone crisis, I remember writing talking points and analyses for my bosses, encouraging the consolidation of European financial instruments and certain advancements in capital markets, and I think as Radovan alluded to earlier, we could have only dreamed of a potential mutualization of debt from a sort of macroeconomic global recovery perspective. And so when we look at it today, this is an important talking point when we talk about sovereignty and the term strategic autonomy. It's important for US policymakers to understand that strong European institutions and strong European governments and strong European economies are in the United States' national interest. And I think that it's been lacking a little bit in the sort of sphere when we start talking about strategic autonomy and people start bristling in Washington. They don't really know. My personal opinion is that people don't really know what that means. And there's a unique role, I believe, for Central European countries to come back and say, no, what we really are talking about are joint initiatives and joint recovery and joint, approach to supply chain security or 5G or any of these issues. Is that you need a strong Europe to be able to meet the sort of demands that Washington may make of its partners. So I think that's an important sort of aspect of when you use the word strategic and autonomy at the same time in Washington to delineate that for your U.S. interlocutors, because they might, from the beginning, not quite understand. The second I would say is about how we achieve recovery. Now, there's going to be an attempt a little bit at protectionism on either sides of the Atlantic. Again, this is a reflection of needing to see to the needs of your people at home, because many people are jobless, and that is not something that any leader should or can ignore. I think going forward, we need to sort of draw the line, right, again, between what we're going to term as economic security and national economic interest, and be able to hopefully together say these are the aspects of our economy that need protection, for either for strategic purposes or for supply chain reasons, and we're going to implement such and such measures to make sure that we're okay. But I think, Elena, as you alluded to, we also have to at the same time make sure that we're not using those tools to go after each other, because that is mutual destruction, right? And you see this through the current administration trying to really take on the China challenge, maybe overstepping its bounds a little too fast, and at the same time thinking, oh, well, Europe is part of the problem, while not taking a step back and saying, okay, how do we actually build this strategy on a structural level, right? So I think going forward, we're going to have to come down to ground a little bit on some of these equities, and say, how are we going to sort of constructively go forward with sort of protectionist measures, we can call them that, vis-a-vis China or Russia or whatever, but not do so in a sort of haphazard way that will undermine our economic growth ultimately and stifle innovation. So I'll close by saying I think that the recovery package from the EU is a huge opportunity for Central Europe in particular, because there will be less of a need to see to help multinationals and large companies that that really are sort of hit immediately by the breakup of global supply chains, and to use those funds really to go into the innovative digital and green technology sectors that really are the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. And you mentioned that in Washington, people often do not know what strategic autonomy means. We must confess that we do not often know what it means in Europe either, or have very divergent opinion about it. So a shared discussion on this matter is definitely long overdue. But one thing is important, that we do not use it against each other indeed. And I will start bringing up the questions from the audience, and I would encourage also the participants to pose questions in the Q&A section. While I'll start picking them up, I will start going back also to the speakers for quick responses to the questions. And we're going to have a kind of a blitz round with quick questions and quick answers. I would like to follow up to the discussion on the digital agenda, but also on the intersection of the EU priorities in the area of digital, but also the 3Cs initiative and how it sees the digital agenda. We also have a question from Elmas Hasanoviki, who is asking about how Central European countries can strengthen regional resilience. And he's particularly interested in how can new and emerging technologies can be implemented in this area. So Konrad, I will go to you first on this matter, because you were speaking about it earlier as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question, for this very interesting question. Okay, so in my opinion, the great chance for Central Europe and 3Cs initiative is to improve connectivity of the region. So one thing is regional integration, to make it more a market, more to make industrial connections between separate countries stronger, because we developed each other as a very good supplier, for example, in automotive sector, and we have our very narrow specialties. But the problem is actually that the way it is organized, there are mostly some advanced concerns or global concerns who are taking our skills, take it together and make a final product. And I think we are slowly getting to the stage when we would like maybe to make products together and have this margin for ourselves also. So this would be one thing. And I would say that that digital and also traditional infrastructure building up would be a great step towards it, because we still have problem that we are more adjusted to east-west trade, east-west investment flows. And actually, maybe it would be also beneficial to make it more on the north-south axis, because we have many suppliers who could cooperate together. And we have also very talented programmers. It comes out. It results from all the rankings, from all the Google or Microsoft competitions, that Central European programmers are very skillful. So it's also a great area for startups. But we need we need to consolidate digital infrastructure. It could be also consolidated together with traditional infrastructure, because there are ideas introduced by Estonians organizers of 3C Summit this year, that actually when we build new highways, we need actually to build already very fast digital connections underneath, so the autonomous cars could use them without any connection breaks, for example, when they cross the borders. So it would be my answer to the question.
Thank you so much. And talking about the digital infrastructure, our audience is also very interested. What exactly can the US and Central Europe do together on 5G? We know that several countries have signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the United States on the issue of 5G, but what exactly would be the next steps of cooperation in this area? And I would be very glad to hear from Martin and Julia on this matter. Martin, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are still some questions to be answered when it comes to network security within 5G. And what came up in my discussions with different people here in Hungary was that sharing some information about the real risks would be really important in understanding the nature of the thing that we're facing. Because right now, it's a highly politicized debate with a very few technical details. And I do feel that having an honest discussion on this and maybe sharing relevant information on what kind of security threats we're talking about would be really useful in finding out that what we're actually dealing with. And also, on the other hand, we're seeing that 5G technology is developing very quickly. And what seemed to be a good idea a few years ago might have significant contenders also on the business side. And I think at the end of the day, this will be a joint decision between the political elite and the economic elite of a country, that what technology to follow. And up to a certain point, I think it is rational to believe that governments will take the security part into consideration as well. But if the price is not right, and we're talking about competitiveness, when we're talking about recovery, that can be a decisive factor. So if we can factor in all the other circumstances, and we can talk about tangible evidence, I think that's a really good way to have a meaningful discussion on what we're facing and how we can resolve the current debates we're having on this issue.
Thank you so much. And I'll bring it back to Julia. Julia, how does the United States convince its Central European partners that the shared vision on 5G is necessary, but also feasible and possible given the economic and business constraints that Martin just outlined?
Sure. I mean, I'd be the first to say that it's not easy. And I think that the development of consensus in Washington was rapid, but also not easy, right? Because when it comes down to it, it's less about tactile evidence of behavior that's already occurred, because again, we're talking about the future development of our technological world, but understanding the patterns of behavior that China has pursued in many other areas, all including in the use of data domestically at home, in China, the treatment of our firms, and the conditions under which it has issued loans and development assistance elsewhere in the world. And so it's about sort of analytically putting the puzzle pieces together. Now, I admit that that's hard because one is faced with a pretty immediate, sometimes economic decision, and it's not always easy to convince the private sector or the service providers or the regulators that this is necessary. And I think that the United States government will continue to go to great lengths to demonstrate to make the case here. But also on the flip side, really trying to develop a marketable alternative to Huawei, right? And I think this started very early on, where the United States government actually approached Western 5G providers and said, "Can you do this?" And so we've gone from "we don't think we can" to "we think we can" in a very short period of time. So these things work in economies of scale. So as we move forward in the coming years, it's I think the intention of the United States to see 5G through secure providers become something marketable that will appeal to local industry and also to decision makers who are looking at a bottom line.
Right, this is actually the area where growing up European champions in the area of 5G can be the case, where the United States and Central Europe and the European Union see each other as partners, and the economic might of each other are reinforcing the partner. Thank you so much for that, Julia. And we have another question from the audience, from Hendrik Plimak, who is wondering about the platforms where the discussion of values is developing. And from his perspective, NATO seems to be the sole platform that is paying attention to the issue of values among the allies. I would like to go to Tomasz and to also Radovan for your perspective on the matter, especially given that the Central Europe is part of the European Union, and the European Union is very actively engaged in the democratic institutions building, but also very much preoccupied with the issue of the rule of law. What, from your perspective, would be the best platform to talk about it, whether it's the EU, NATO, or maybe it's bilateral relations between the countries? Radovan, would you like to go first? Okay, I don't seem to.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick response to a question, which platform is better, depends who is talking about it. So if we are talking about the transatlantic cooperation, of course, it's NATO. If you are talking about the rule of law and liberal democracy in Europe, it's EU. But at the same time, these two platforms are necessarily interconnected. When I talked about the partnership based on shared interests, I mean our transatlantic partnership, of course, we need to interconnect these two debates. Now, when we talk about the EU, I see the European cooperation or European integration as a rule-based cooperation based on, as I said, shared or converging interests. I don't think that this kind of cooperation is sustainable without liberal democracy as the the elements that are building this cooperation. Liberal democracy means many things, and it rests on a set of institutions. Elections, which have been mentioned, they are one of. But there are also other institutions like the rule of law, including independence of judiciary, like the protection of human rights and liberties, including academic liberty, independence of media, and so on and so forth. The EU has not been very well equipped to protect these institutions that are kind of a base for the liberal democracy. One of the reasons might be that the liberal democracy was taken for granted, in a sense. I mean, this was the condition for being member of the EU. And the liberalization and democratization has been a process. Now, I think we see that it's not so easy. It's not so straightforward. There could be backlashes, and with the rising nationalism, with rising illiberal tendencies in Europe, I think EU needs stronger institutions for kind of protecting liberal democracy, including the rule of law, independence of media, judiciary, and so within the EU in the member states. But also it needs them to strengthen the European Union as such, because as I said at the beginning, I don't think the cooperation is sustainable unless it's built by liberal democracies. And then that's how it could also engage with the US on the discussion about the values on the transatlantic level.
Thank you so much, Radovan. And I'll pose the same question to Tomasz. How do we bring back the values and through which platforms?
Thank you very much, Lena. Well, if we had this discussion 4 years ago, I would have, let's say, NATO would be a very effective platform. But I think we've seen how much distrust with the NATO members Donald Trump has sowed. And I think it will be very hard to repair, even if he doesn't win the second term. So I think that was one of the things we need to focus on, how to again return trust into NATO, that it will indeed be a functioning organization when any of the members need it to be functional. And there are a lot of question marks. I think we all remember that actually this distrust into US and Turkey started the whole discussions about European defense a couple of years ago, when we felt we need to build an alternative in the case that either Turkey or the US blocks NATO from acting when it will be needed. So that is one thing. And again, I think it's very important to save NATO, make sure it is functioning. We don't have an alternative, and Europe cannot go it alone, not today, not in 5 years. So that is important to keep in mind. Of course, for the values, I think the EU is an important platform because this is where actually values are defined as what unites the members. And it's the beginning of the treaty of the EU. It calls about shared values. But the question is, can we actually be effective in defending them? And I'm referring to the discussion of how many things in the EU need to be decided by unanimous votes, whether we should be actually moving to qualified majority on many of the issues. And I remember when we started with most of our Central European colleagues pushing for a disinformation unit within the European Commission back in 2015, how tough and uphill battle it was with many other member states who were saying, well, we don't need to deal with disinformation. It's not important for us. And again, we see that the EU is also losing a lot of its appeal because very often one or two member states block things either 25 or 26 would agree on. And it makes us significantly weaker. So that is I think, significant part of the discussion we need to be having because I think we have technically two great platforms, but I think both are much weaker than they should be. And if I may go back to the 5G in a few seconds also. I think 5G is a nice buzzword, but what we, I think, fail to deal with is that there's also a lot of Chinese infrastructure already built in place in 4G in many of the IT systems. So yes, 5G is a future threat, but there's possibly a lot of existing threats in the technical infrastructure we already should be dealing with, and we can't. Also because in many cases, we fail to take the security issues into the purchasing decisions by governments. We all focus too much on the lowest bidder, the cheapest opportunity, and in all that, China will always have an advantage with the government funding many of the potential suppliers have. So that is also another huge challenge that we sometimes omit because 5G is much more interesting to talk about by itself.
That was a very sobering assessment, but not without hope. And thank you also for bringing in the disinformation aspect, because I remember some 5 or 6 years ago, US and Central Europe worked a lot on the bilateral issues, and that was due also to the cooperation between the Central European and American partners that we became so skilled in identifying it and then managed to bring it up at the EU level. And now it's the European Union that is seen as being on the front lines of fighting disinformation, especially in the digital space. We will slowly be wrapping up the discussion, but we still have 3 or 4 minutes. So I would like to go back to all the speakers with a very brief question for which I would welcome a 20-second answer. And the question is very easy. What would be the first step that the next president of the United States would need to make to reinforce the transatlantic relations? Julia, you're the closest to the decision-making center in Washington, D.C., so I would ask you to go first.
Showing up.
Very concise and very telling. Thank you so much. Radovan.
I would say engaging in an honest and open debate.
Thank you so much. Seems to be very easy so far. Martin.
Well, then I'll make it a bit more complicated. I think if the next administration, whatever, in 2 months or 4 years, could take a little bit more diversified view on the region and not always treat the countries of Central and Eastern Europe as a package deal, that would be really useful. So having a tailor-made approach to all the different governments in the region could be really great. And I know it's a tough job and it requires resources, and most of the resources are directed to Asia at the moment. But recognizing the differences between these countries would be very great.
And that's where the organizations like Atlantic Council are playing a very important role in helping the administration to be more informed about the peculiarities of each country in the region. Tomasz, what would be your take?
I would welcome 3 simple things from the next president. First, make sure we are friends and not enemies. Second one, can go back also to dealing with joint values, not only with the transactions. And the third one, also jointly invest more into helping others, whether it's post-Soviet countries, whether it's bumping up Radio Free Europe. There will be many things we can do in the region we all care about and we always had a joint interest in.
Thank you so much. And Konrad.
Okay, I would have 2 proposals. First, invest even more political and economic capital in 3Cs initiative. And second, maybe a little undiplomatic, but to put still much pressure on Europe, because I would say that getting us out of comfort zone made us advanced in either in debate about NATO or in the debate about 5G network. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a list of proposals which include showing up, engaging more, having diversified and nuanced approach to the region, make sure that we are friends and not enemies, that we emphasize joint values, invest political and economic capital into 3Cs initiative, jointly invest into shaping the world around us, and put more pressure on Europe to deliver on all possible aspects of cooperation. And the latter point definitely gives a lot of homework for Europe too. With this, I would like to thank all the panelists and all the participants who joined us for this very enriching discussion. And thank you very much again to the Atlantic Council for organizing the fantastic Central European Week. Please follow the developments online using the hashtag Central Europe Week on Twitter. All the events are being broadcast live, and we're very happy and grateful for having you with us today. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining.